Hi there, my name is Gianlucas Sherrill. Many topics that are talked about today involve the consequences of the coronavirus pandemic, which I'm sure had a direct impact on the way that many of us live our lives. Now, more specifically, it made us cut some of our lowest priorities that we used to take for granted, which famously includes travel, for example. I'm sure the cancellation of things like vacation plans and family visits must have been really hard for some people. Now, I want to talk about how particularly international travel has been affected in many countries outside the US and hopefully introduce a broader perspective on the whole issue of travel and what some of us had to endure just to make what otherwise would have been a simple international flight. Now, I come from Peru, and not too long ago I moved into my dorm here at EMU after arriving to the US. Now, I have to admit that my trip must have worked out perfectly thanks to some miracle, because in a country like Peru, international travel was severely limited and restricted to a very specialized audience, which is comprised of US citizens and legal permanent residents. Now, I'd like to talk about my experience during that trip in this opportunity. Now, I'd first like to introduce you guys to the whole premise of flights coming out of South American countries like Peru. Now, as I've said before, my home country was completely shut down as of the beginning of the pandemic, including all border closures. So the only way to fly in or out of the country was to obtain tickets for these special charter flights, which periodically became available for purchase. Now, these flights were organized by the US Embassy as humanitarian flights, which ran from March to June of this year. These flights were intended to help out stranded American tourists and citizens to return to the US safely despite the lockdown. But subsequent flights, which were labeled as repatriation flights, which ran from June to October of this year, were organized by private travel agencies, which were authorized by the US Embassy. The flight that I took to come to the US, in fact, was one of these flights. Now, as far as I remember, my ticket cost about $1,200. So it certainly wasn't cheap, especially considering how the economy of my country was so severely impacted. But luckily, my family did save up for this occasion. Now, if you were lucky enough to obtain one of these tickets fast enough, there was yet another layer of complicated measures that you had to go through, as thousands of people were trying to compete for only a couple hundred of seats that were available on each of these flights. First of all, the company had to be aware of not sending any individuals who were exposed to or had COVID-19, obviously. Now, since these policies did not seem to require passengers to have a recent negative COVID test, I remember that any kind of symptom of the virus, no matter how small or insignificant, could automatically deem you ineligible to board the flight, and you would end up losing your non-refundable $1,200. And that was a situation that I certainly wanted to avoid. Now, this is probably one of the most daunting characteristics of the whole experience. Every passenger was obligated to wear a face mask and a plastic face shield in order to be safe, quote unquote, inside the aircraft. I actually have the plastic face shield that I utilized on my flight. You would actually end up looking something like this, along with a mask, of course. Pretty creepy. Okay, so moving on to what I think is probably one of the scariest parts of the entire story. As the only international airport in Peru, which is located in Lima, was closed down, these private charter flights were actually set to depart from military Air Force bases, which had extremely strict guidelines for boarding these flights. I am not kidding, it was incredibly scary. The company that actually handled the charter flights even said that passengers should expect to spend hours waiting to board the plane while standing in the middle of the airstrip with no place to sit even. Now, when I first heard this, I admit I began to feel quite scared about the whole trip. I mean, I was a 17-year-old about to take his very first international flight alone by himself and having to go through all these conditions. It was pretty overwhelming for quite a while, I have to admit. Now, as time went on, a few interesting changes actually happened to my plans. So first, my flight, which was originally supposed to leave from this Air Force base on August the 14th, I believe, was actually cancelled by the Peruvian government at the very last minute. So I thought for sure at that time that I wasn't gonna make it on time for move-in date, as the government was seemingly not keen on announcing information ahead of time for some reason. So they really left me hanging there for a little while. But suddenly, I did receive good news in the end, as the government announced that my flight would be reprogrammed for August the 19th, so 5 days ahead. So I was going to make it to my first semester after all, on time for move-in date. Now, in addition to that, the flight would actually no longer have to leave from this military base, as the Peruvian government began to experiment usage of the commercial international airport, which at that time had been closed. So I was quite relieved that I wouldn't have to go to such a scary place. So after telling you guys about this entire experience, I would say that things did work out a lot better than I originally had expected them to. I didn't run into any more delays or unexpected obstacles, and I was able to arrive here to the US early, safe and sound, and also coronavirus free, thankfully. And honestly, I have no regrets about anything at this point. I would say that it has been more than 2 months since I went through this whole deal, and I probably don't remember it as fondly as I would have, say, in early September, for instance. And I would say that the only true way to really understand how everything worked out is to go through it yourself. But I hope that my explanation of the whole process I had to go through on a simple international flight kind of broaden your vision on how travel was so severely impacted at a global scale because of the coronavirus pandemic. So I'd like to thank you for watching.